Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Jason Durall, who is the line editor for Lords of the Middle Sea and for all things BRP at Chaosium. I wanted Jason to talk a little bit about the different kinds of TTRPG writing styles that are out there. Jason has worked across a whole variety of different TTRPG companies and on a ton of different projects for all kinds of systems. I started off the interview by asking him, is there a consistency to TTRPG writing styles, or does the format change radically depending what kind of book you're reading? I'll jump across to the interview in just a moment, but first, please remember to subscribe to the Chaosium YouTube channel, and thanks for watching.
It is an absolute kaleidoscope of styles and approaches to RPG writing. And the rise of indie RPGs and sort of the little bit of the OSR stuff has created this just entirely new array of approaches to how to present information and to get rules and content into the hands of the players and the game master. So yeah, it's all over the place. There is no, maybe 20 years ago, there was a very sort of solid band of most RPG writing falls into this category or this style, but now it's all over the place.
Maybe it would be best to start with asking, how is TTRPG writing different from normal writing?
Oh, well, tabletop RPG writing is really a mix of two disciplines. It is the ability to write compelling content and to describe things as if you're writing a, I mean, it's in some ways a cross between writing a travel log or a, like a tourist guide to an area, like in the case of writing gazetteer content or descriptions of travel and aspects of that. It's cultural anthropology writing in that you want to present fair and balanced and interesting and useful descriptions of the cultures and the peoples and the creatures that you, the player characters might encounter, you know, in a way that is immediately accessible to the game master. And it also is a mix of very technical information, sort of trying to convey rules mechanics in as clean and efficient a style as possible, and to constantly be aware of the order in which information is best processed. You know, like how do people think, like what questions are they asking as they're reading something? What's the best place to answer that question? And then there's a lot of absolute just UX and UI related stuff, like where do you put sidebars? How do you call out things? Is it bolding? Is it, do you want to use bullet points in this? Do you know, trying not to bury information in the center of paragraphs? Always front load information and then explain later rather than, you know, building up to a case and then saying the rule is blah. So, and again, it's all over the place. I mean, there's a lot of the newer stuff like Morkborg or Warpland, where you've got very heavy emphasis on themes and content, you know, quotes from the background lore, even RPG, you know, the actual game mechanics text is written in sort of a almost thematic way that evokes the world itself. Whereas you've got things like 13th Age, where you've got, you know, fairly straightforward text, but interspersed with constant sidebars and commentary from Rob Heinzu and Jonathan Tweet with their thoughts about mechanics and why this works this way. And so it is, it's, you know, there's a lot of different ways to approach this kind of material, but, you know, to each their own, I suppose. And it's always a challenge to try to figure out the right voice for a particular work if it hasn't already been established.
I think by definition, it's going to be really difficult to understand the full scope of a kaleidoscope by nature.
Yes.
So I'd love to know what the different range of projects that you've worked on personally have displayed in terms of their different writing style.
Okay, well, for example, RuneQuest, I've been quite lucky in that both Greg Stafford and Jeff Richard have very distinct writing styles that are very, very American, and I think very logical in tone. Greg didn't really go for a lot of like flights of fancy or poetic language in his descriptions of how game mechanics would work and how people would work. He was very much like, let me get the information to you and lay it down as factually as possible. And so I think since Jeff came from, a lot of prior work, and then the Guide to Glorantha, which is sort of our Bible for developing new content for RuneQuest, it is a very encyclopedic approach to that material. And when it comes to game mechanics, I'm trying to bring as much simplification as possible and trying to clean up the language so that it's as easy to read as possible, and using techniques like, making things in bullets, making them using boldface for very key points. And I can't say that I'm getting it right all the time, but I'm hopefully improving as that goes. And then there are other projects like, for example, Conan, which I was line editor of for almost 5 years. And that was I would say, a very muscular style of writing. The text was, for mechanics and rules, was trying to be as lean as possible. I wasn't directly writing the content or the rules mechanics. I wrote quite a bit, but I wasn't the primary on that. But the descriptions of places, we were trying for the sort of like, how would Conan view these places? And so there were a lot of adjectives and descriptions of things that verged into Howardian poetics, that kind of evoking the feel through the flavor mechanics or the flavor text, and lots of quotes from Robert E. Howard to sort of evoke the world as experienced through Conan, or by proxy, the player character's eyes. I'm working on a adventure thing for Warpland, which is also very stark, very elemental, a little brutal, but also has this sort of post-apocalyptic, weird religious feeling to it, which is quite fun. And then, other things. Dune was trying to be very straightforward, very efficient, very science fiction-y, almost in tone. Like, even though it's a Baroque feudal empire, the language that I was trying to evoke with both the rules and the content writing was very similar to Frank Herbert's stuff. And Frank Herbert came from being from a self-taught scientific background, and so he approached his world building and his universe very, very scientifically. And so, approaching that is like sort of the goal there. Whereas the Call of Cthulhu writing I've done, almost all not directly for Call of Cthulhu, but for other ancillary projects, that all has, the idea is to sort of try to build a sense of creeping dread, but at the same time, lull people, the players, the investigators, into a sense of familiarity, and then tune up the strangeness.
That's a wide spectrum of different approaches. And I love the term muscular writing, particularly suitable for Conan, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a form of very visible TTRPG writing style that you haven't personally worked in? Is there, you talked about that sort of very stylistic indie TTRPG style. Have you had a chance to dive into that? And if so, or if not, I guess, what do you admire about it? What do you think does it well? What makes up that style definitively?
Again, it's all over the place. I mean, there are some that are almost as if the game master or the creator is telling, like sort of just explaining things to the game master so that they can explain them to the player characters. This very chummy, very sometimes full of in-jokes, very light, casual, breezy kind of writing. And I haven't had the chance to work on anything like that yet. I might dip my toe into it. It's kind of funny in that the Lords of the Middle Sea manuscript, which I've been working on for, the better part of the last 3 years, has it's a much lighter tone than RuneQuest, and it's much more aimed at casual readers and new players sort of, it's not really trying to like dig into impressing or bestowing the setting upon players. It's meant to give a window into the game and get people playing as soon as possible, and also indicate it's a lighter, more fun game experience than something a little more, I would say, a little more grounded in the setting like RuneQuest. But for example, my editor, she's done a lot of work on our Mythic Iceland game and some RuneQuest stuff, and she looked at the Lords of the Middle Sea game rules, and she's been editing some of the stuff, and she was like, "Oh my God, this is also casual." And I said, "No, that's the way it's supposed to be." She's like, "I thought something was wrong here. It was totally against the voice that the other material had." And I had to say, "No, don't change that. That's intentional. It's a shift in our authorial voice." But as for that, I mean, there are some game mechanics or settings that I would love to dig into. The little bit of writing I did back on the Decipher Lord of the Rings game a long time ago, that was quite fun to try to build a sort of Tolkien-esque flavor and voice. I did a bit of work on the Serenity RPG, which was really strange because I was, basically trying to evoke that sort of Civil War, frontier, pioneer voice that show has, with the same smartass, cynical, jokey references. And that even boils into the mechanics of the game, which was quite an interesting experience doing. I had almost forgotten about that, but yeah, that was fun. There was this book about, it was called like a pilgrim girl's, or not a pilgrim, a frontier girl's diary. And it was, apparently it was one of the Firefly writing team's Bibles, this book. And when I heard about it, I was thinking, no, that can't be it. And I read it and I went, oh my God, every character talks like this. So I like read through that and sort of got that into my head. And then, the little bit of the sort of cynical smartassedness tone to the show's dialogue. And that informed the writing of the content for the Firefly, or it was the Serenity game. It was before it became the Firefly game.
You made a reference to authorial voice. And of course, there's such a enormous range of amazing TTRPG writers out there. I don't think it's in general possible to say, oh, well, give us like an example of all the different authorial voices. But in the same way that you look at screenwriters and you say they tend to do very short sentences, kind of restricted prose because the medium fits that. You look at writers like, H.P. Lovecraft or Stephen King, who have these very long phrases, manuscripts like that. Is there a style that you note that applies generally to tabletop role-playing game writers?
Oh, I would say honestly, it's generally almost a, I would just call it textbook style. It's not really American textbook style, it's UK textbook, but I noticed that most authors, and it might be a generational thing, many of the authors of my generation and maybe 10 or 20 years under me tend to write, or behind me, tend to write things in a very straightforward fashion, sort of almost AP magazine style, article style, where we're really just trying to get information to the players. And I think that is probably the most basic style, but also the one that is the most adaptable. It seems like if you can write decent content and text and rules mechanics in a straightforward, easy to read style with, usability as the primary goal, then you can adapt to almost any other, format. Like it's easy enough to take the normal format, this sort of straightforward, basic style, and like lean into like hardcore dungeon fantasy with it, or flavor it with Westernisms, for like, say you were writing an Old West game or something like that. I think that kind of stuff is easy to go. Personally, I find going too overboard in the vernacular of the characters or the idiom of speech of the world makes things very difficult to it's not a usability plus, so to speak. It works against easy familiarity, you know. And I mean, you end up with some games, you know, I don't think it's unfair to say games like, you know, Hold, for example, if anyone remembers that old game where it was all handwritten and it was all edgy and very you know, kind of crazy and full of cynicism and snarkiness and jokes. It was a very funny game to read, but I can't imagine anyone actually being able to play it successfully. So that's why I'm also a bit curious about the upcoming this Monty Python RPG that's going to launch in Kickstarter. I'm actually eager to see it, but I'm also wondering about you know, whether it will be something that's hilarious to read, almost unplayable, or whether they'll find a good mix. I hope a good mix. It seems like it'd be a fun game to play.
I have one last question for you, and that's about styles that don't necessarily work so well. And you kind of alluded a little bit to that in your last answer, but is there a type of writing when somebody gives you a manuscript for a TTRPG and you see that it is written in a specific style, you go, this won't work, this needs to be completely changed, or this is something that it is very, very difficult to get right?
I have had instances where I think people get far too into the poetry of their language, and whereas something I think would read quite wonderfully as prose doesn't necessarily read well as game mechanics or setting, you know. I have occasionally encountered material in various licensed games where people seemed like they were almost writing promotional text versus area descriptions. You know, it felt like I was reading the advertising vacation package version of these descriptions of areas. And I was thinking, this weirdly upbeat tone is kind of at jarring with the reality of the setting or the overall tone you should be trying to convey there. Usually people get mechanic stuff straightforward enough. I mean, I find I do a lot of simplifying game mechanics, trying to clean up sentences and make them as readable as possible and as methodical as a way of teaching people. But it's usually content that people get tripped up in because they sort of want to write everything as if it were a, you know, a section in a like a book, a work of fiction or whatnot, and that can be sort of problematic. And I mean, the other thing that occasionally I find people do is they just completely miss the experience of like what does the game master have to describe, to hang their descriptions of this area in. And so frequently with content writers or scenario writers, I'm pushing back with like, what does this character look like? What do they sound like? You know, I mean, this is not a screenplay where you just like the actor will fill in the description and what they sound like, but or the prop and set decorators will describe the area. The game master has to know these kinds of materials. So those are things that I usually find don't work, is when people are just they miss providing useful information, or they're just too vague, and or, you know, converse, sometimes I have to pull back and I just get rid of an absolute ton of tedious background material. I mean, and I am guilty of it. Recently I did I had a weird project that I had written for the Mongoose Conan game back in the early 2000s, and like 2002 or 3, but the project got canceled for various reasons. And so it sort of sat around in my hard drive forever, multiple computers just passing along. And then when I was working on the Modivius Conan game, it came, they said, hey, we need a big epic Conan campaign. And I said, well, I have a big epic Conan campaign written for the D20 Mongoose version. And they said, could you update it for 2D20? And I said, sure. And then going back over material I had written 20 years prior was just painful, because I just went, oh my God, I'm just detailing every scrap of parchment in everybody's pockets. I mean, every room, I'm like, here is the kitchen for this mansion. There are knives in a rack. And it's like, why is this necessary? There's this kind of tedious level of detail is not necessary for the sort of action-packed, I want to say pulpy cinematic style of gameplay of Conan, the Modiphius game, but for D20/D&D style Conan, knowing that the knife rack has a knife that does 1d3 points of damage, and this is how much you can sell every single widget that the characters can pick up. That kind of stuff is incredibly useful for that game. So I found that I was doing a lot of just like cutting words constantly and just vast sections of descriptive text. So yeah.
If you had one last thing you wanted to say about TTRPG writing styles to both the professionals who are currently or who will be writing it and the people who are going to be reading it, what would it be?
I would say that there is no one true way to write RPG material, but if you're going to submit something for a line, be prepared to have an editor sort of get it to conform to the existing style of the line, read and know the material in the line. And if you're going to submit work, make it fit. It is not a slight against your particular voice or what distinctness you bring to a project. But in most cases now, when people are writing RPG materials, they're usually part of a group of writers. And having like 5 or 6 completely different voices all expressing themselves in completely different ways from an editorial and a reader standpoint can create a sort of a jarring mix of styles. So I would say ultimately, like my advice to RPG professionals is, as always, keep a very thick skin about the notion that there will be changes, that your material will probably, if you do not submit it in a format that conforms to what the current editorial voice is for a particular line, you should probably expect that your work will be edited to fit that voice. And when I was a beginning writer, I struggled with this sometimes. I would get red lines and I would look and go, why did they change this particular sentence? There's nothing wrong with this sentence. And then I would look later and I'd go, oh, actually, yeah, that's like somebody in the very next paragraph that was not me had something different to say, or that sentence shows up in another format in another section. So I would say just try to make your stuff fit if at all possible. And eventually, or hopefully, you will find ways that your work can express yourself and who you are. And I think ultimately you'll get a better sense of how to really bring your own voice to projects. And I mean, ultimately, with the sheer availability of self-publishing and the plethora of smaller presses going now, there's absolutely no reason why anyone should have to feel like all they can do is write material that conforms to someone else's vision.